This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Alberta.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This interview is being recorded on the sidelines of a conference at Brandeis University's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, titled Democracy and Its Alternatives, The Origins of Israel's Current Crisis. Our guest, a fellow at the Schusterman Center's Institute for Advanced Israel Studies, is speaking at the conference. Julie Cooper is a senior lecturer in political science at Tel Aviv University. Julie, hello and welcome.
Glad to be here.
So the 7th of October marked an almost unprecedented crisis of confidence for Israelis. The fundamental promise of Zionism, that Jewish grannies could no longer be snatched from the beds by killers, was breached. Do you think that there are any long-term ramifications to anticipate in terms of Israelis' sense of security and their attachment to their political project?
I do, but before I describe what I think those long-term ramifications are, I think I should make a distinction between the immediate political moment, which is one in which, it actually does seem, to my surprise, possible that Bibi Netanyahu will remain in power and that he could emerge from this debacle unscathed. And so I do want to make clear that I think the immediate political moment is one in which it seems like very little has changed, although the protest movement is slowly coming back in full force. And it's possible that this will be the moment when the fundamental cleavages of Israeli society that were suppressed a bit with the onset of the war, emerge again, and a much more contentious political discourse emerges. But I think what I would like to focus on is what I see as the long-term implications of an event like October 7th, which I think is an event of such magnitude that, again, I don't want to predict its potential consequences, but I really do think it changes the self-understanding of Israeli Jews and Jews worldwide, precisely because it in some ways shattered the myth that the state of Israel is an exception to the fraught dynamics of Jewish political history, because the very kind of violence to which Jews were subject in diaspora, pogroms, random attacks, the establishment of the state of Israel was meant to insulate Jews from that particular kind of violence, even while it exposed them to other kinds of violence, such as military conscription. And I think the shock of this event, which really did in many ways shatter the pretensions of the state of Israel to be an exceptional place in Jewish history, challenges many of the fundamental claims of Zionism about the importance of sovereignty, the importance of the nation state, and the ways in which the establishment of a Jewish nation state was going to change the entire course of modern Jewish history. And I think at this moment, it is harder to claim that the establishment of the state of Israel as a nation, as an ethnic nation state, really did change the course of Jewish history. And so, again, it's too soon to tell, but I do think there's an experience almost of re-diasporization in which Israeli Jews suddenly realize that their vulnerability was not that different from that of their ancestors and grandparents in Poland or Iraq and other places in the diaspora, and that the faith they had in the state has been shattered. And I want to believe that kind of experience can open up new political possibilities, precisely because it is so traumatic.
So when you talk about a rupture in the faith in sovereignty, or in the belief in Jewish sovereignty as a solution, you're actually talking about something that is quite recent historically, right?
Recent historically, in terms of October 7th, or recent historically going back to, say, the 1990s and other crises of sovereignty that we've been experiencing in recent history?
I just think that maybe for our listeners, you have this particular view on sovereignty
Yeah.
and its possibilities and its others, or sovereignty and its significant others. And I'm just curious just to hear a little bit about that before we move back into the significance of October 7th to these intellectual questions.
Okay. Well, let me say a few things. First of all, obviously, Zionism is a very complicated movement, a contentious movement in which there were fierce debates about what the point of Zionism was. Was it to create a political entity? Was it to revive Hebrew culture? If the point of was to create a new political community, what was the political form that was going to enable Jewish self-determination? So I want to flag that prior to, I'd say, the late 30s, maybe the beginning of World War II, there actually was a lot of debate internal to Zionism about whether the political entity that Zionists were striving to establish was going to be a nation state. And there were certainly proponents of binationalism, of federalism, and as historians like Dmitry Shumsky have shown, these proposals for regimes other than the nation state were advocated actually by quite mainstream Zionists. It wasn't just the people, we think of Brit Shalom and people on the left who were advocating forms of binationalism, but actually even in some of writings by quite mainstream thinkers like Jabotinsky, there was an openness to a variety of political forms, and it was not a foregone conclusion that the Jewish political entity that was going to be created was going to be a nation state. And when I say nation state, I guess I should clarify that I mean the current state of Israel is a classic nation state in the sense that it defines itself not as the state of all of its citizens, not as the state of all people who live there, but rather as the state of the Jewish people. And it, as a result of that self-definition as the state of the Jewish people, does privilege Jews in law in various ways, and there are differential forms of citizenship which reflect the state's commitment to Jewish peoplehood as opposed to the fate of all of its citizens. So that's what I mean when I say that Israel is a nation state. So going back to where I was a minute ago, I'll just reiterate that probably, I'd say, till the late 1930s, arguably in response to the Holocaust, there was no consensus amongst Zionists that the nation state was going to be the regime type that we had to establish in order to facilitate or realize the dream of Jewish self-determination. With World War II, with the Holocaust, I think there was an increasing sense that Jews had to have a nation state of their own, and given the nature of the global order, the nation state was the best possibility. And in fact, as we know, the way history turned out, Israel was established as a nation state, again, that enshrines in law certain privileges for Jewish citizens over non-Jewish citizens.
But when it comes to really the security of Jews, the actual physical security, which is the question that the 7th of October unravels in this sense, what really are the benefits of a nation state in actually protecting the security of citizens, as opposed to other alternatives that might have happened in Jewish history or the future?
Okay, that's a great question, and it reminds me of a conversation I once had with Michael Walzer, who, as some of your listeners may know, is a very prominent political theorist,
and a former guest on the Tel Aviv Review too.
Yes, and very engaged with Jewish politics and Israeli politics, and in a conversation with him once, in which I was advocating for a kind of federal, confederal solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and arguing that we have to come up with an alternative to those standard two-state solution, and find ways to devolve power to local communities and allow autonomy for Haredi communities, Palestinian communities, et cetera, essentially arguing that we had to think beyond the standard two-state solution and experiment with these alternative regimes. He said to me, in an autonomy, Jews don't have a foreign policy of their own. And it seemed like a very powerful criticism that, Jews need a foreign policy, and the only way that Jews are going to have a foreign policy is if they have a nation state. And if we try to experiment with, federal, confederal solutions of various kinds, how are Jews going to have the foreign policy that they need? And I take the force of that objection, and I think he's right. But at the same time, I think that's one of the crises of October 7th, is precisely that, okay, finally Jews had a state that enabled them to have a very aggressive foreign policy and distinctive, presence and voice on the world stage. We had a very powerful army. We had an intelligence service that was ostensibly, one of the most sophisticated intelligence services in the world, and none of them anticipated or prevented or even repelled this attack. So I think that's in part where the depth of the crisis comes from, is that, all the accoutrements of sovereignty that we have always been told are going to protect Jews from these forms of violence that have pervaded Jewish history. It turned out at this critical moment of October 7th that they failed. And, you could say, well, they failed on this one occasion, and so that doesn't necessarily have to inspire this fundamental crisis of conscience. But I guess I do think there was something about the depth of the shock, the way people experienced it, the way people described the event as a pogrom, and just, the sense, I never thought this would happen here, I think really does cause people to rethink their deep faith and confidence in the nation state as what was supposed to usher in a qualitative change in Jewish history.
The thing is that we talk about sovereignty as if it was this whole sovereignty, where we know that one of the situation which we are in for at least since 1967, is a situation of multiple graded sovereignties without a boundary. We have a boundaryless state with its undetermined and decidedly undetermined borders, with these different grades of sovereignty and grades of citizenship and grades of belonging to the polity. And so in the end of the day, how much is this a shift? Or is this a culmination of this kind of longer process of undecidedness of sovereignty?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because, one of the fundamental definitions of sovereignty is that, you have absolute authority over a limited territorially defined space. And as Yael just pointed out, that is not the case of the state of Israel, right? It's a state that doesn't have borders and refuses to define its borders. And, within the space over which the Israeli regime rules, there are people with differential statuses, some citizens, some lesser citizens, some subjects and not citizens at all. So I think you could actually argue that the sovereignty of Israel has always been a fantasy. And that's even before we talk about Israel as a client state of the United States and Israel's dependence on the United States and foreign aid and all of that, which again, in some ways, has already undermines the fiction of Israeli sovereignty. So I think, in a way, you're right that Israeli sovereignty has always been illusory, and it may be the case that one of the things that happened on October 7th was precisely that these aspects of the regime that Israeli Jews wanted to forget, namely the fact that their state power extended over regions in which millions of people were subject to Israeli law without having a voice, without voting, without being part of the regime. Like that precisely those crises that Israelis wanted to forget and repress came back with a vengeance, and they can't be forgotten and they can't be repressed in any sense. So I think that in a way, October 7th, as I think you can read it as the culmination of this ongoing crisis of sovereignty in the region.
Another area of these shades of grey is, of course, the people who belong to the state but are not its citizens. I'm talking mainly about the diaspora. Yeah. And they've traditionally seen in Israel as a marker of identity and also a refuge of sorts. Like if something happens, they can always go back. If there are pogroms in America or wherever, they can always go to Israel and be protected. To what extent do you think that this kind of crisis of conscience pervades Zionist Jews around the world?
I think October 7th certainly has created a massive crisis for Jews in the diaspora, and exacerbated the fissures that were already there in diasporic Jewish communities. I'll focus mostly on America, but certainly in America there were, prior to October 7th, definitely widening gaps between attitudes towards Israel on the part of young Jews versus their parents' generation, their grandparents' generation. And October 7th, I think, really brought those fissures to the fore, because suddenly, for vast numbers of Jewish youth who maybe were indifferent to Israel, or felt like Israel was not part of their identity, now Israel is something that they can't avoid, and they can't avoid it precisely because Israel is committing these, gross human rights violations and violations of the laws of war, and creating a massive humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And so suddenly the question of, what is the relationship of diaspora Jews to Israel is one that cannot be avoided. And I think that, for older Jews, I think it's, and for some of them, it's really sort of reinforced their commitment to Israel, precisely because it's, reactivated all of these fears. But I think for younger Jews, and even for many older liberal Jews, it really is creating a crisis of conscience of sorts about. Not that they ever thought that Israel was going to be their city of refuge in time of crisis, but I think it still was an important part of their identity as a national identity, not just as a religious identity. And now it's become very hard to identify with the state of Israel. And I think, it's interesting, during the judicial reform, I do think a lot of liberal American Jews were very excited and felt like they could sort of recommit to Israel after long periods in which American Jews were alienated. Liberal American Jews were alienated because
of the liberal backlash to the judicial overhaul?
Yes, exactly. So I think prior to the judicial reform, many liberal American Jews did feel increasingly alienated from Israel because of the occupation, because of the right-wing government, and suddenly the protest movement against the judicial reform really kind of rekindled some sort of hope on the part of a lot of liberal American Jews that, the political. First of all, there was just an excitement, I think. Many of my friends, relatives came to Israel. Like, the first thing they wanted to do was go to Kaplan. And, the first thing they wanted to do was post pictures on Facebook of, Saturday night protests at Kaplan. And so I think there was a sense that, like, maybe there's political movement here and we can support this movement and try to change the political dynamics of Israel in the same way that in America, we're fighting Trumpism and it's part of a larger campaign for democracy. And I think October 7th kind of put a damper on that excitement and turned that excitement into grave worry.
I want to go back to sovereignty and its alternatives. So in your work, what you're doing is using a lot of past ways of thinking and past interpretations of Zionist thinking in order to think of possibilities in the future. And I think so many people are really open to hearing new ways of thinking because of this rupture. And be it from a place of fear or from a place of hope that maybe there are possible solutions. So when you talk about those alternatives, what are you talking about?
There's a range of alternatives. So maybe I'll start by saying alternatives to what, and I think when I talk about alternatives, I am mostly thinking about alternatives to the nation state, and in the current context, to alternatives to the classic two-state solution, which Biden and others are trying to revive. But I think prior to their attempts to revive it, there was a widespread sense that the two-state solution, for many different reasons, was a dead letter and had failed. The two-state solution assumes that a just resolution to the conflict would be one in which we create two nation states in each nation state there'll be a maximum correspondence between the ethnos and the demos, right? The ethnic identity of the members of that polity and their civic identity, right? So the idea would be, let's draw the borders so that on one side we have mostly Jews and one side we have mostly Palestinians, and so that way we would enable national self-determination for both parties.
Which is basically partition thinking.
Right, exactly. Which I do want to say, I don't think it's an inherently problematic form of thinking, because I think, if you really could draw the borders such that, almost 100% of people on one side were Jewish and almost 100% of people on the other side were Palestinian, you really could achieve a democratic form of national self-determination. But in practice, we know that almost all nation states have large minority populations who are not included in the national self-definition and are subject to various forms of discrimination, second-class citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. So in the Israel-Palestine, in that region, of course, there's an intense intermingling of populations, and increasingly so as a result of post-67 and as a result of the settlement movement. And I think, therefore creating serious obstacles to the possibility of neatly partitioning the region in a way that actually would be democratic and actually would enable equal rights to self-determination for all peoples living in the region. And so in light of the failure of the two-state solution to enact this split, many people have tried to think more creatively about ways to on the one hand, honor people's national self-identity, honor the fact that Jews and Palestinians actually do have very strong national identities that they want to retain and they want to give political expression to, while at the same time trying to imagine egalitarian forms of living that would allow people to express these national identities politically in an equal way, as opposed to the way that they're currently expressed, which accords supremacy to Jewish self-determination at the expense of Palestinian self-determination. And so, again, if we go back to the early period of Zionist history, and here I'm thinking of the interwar period, again, prior to the Holocaust, prior to the partition plan, there were many different proposals ranging from cantonization. People were inspired by the Swiss model, to federalism, sometimes inspired by American models, confederalism, autonomism, which is a model that draws on diasporic Jewish history. And these are all models that try to envision the self-determination of peoples living in close proximity to one another, allowing, say, for situations in which, if we can imagine a neighborhood in which Jews and Palestinians live together on the same street, Jews might vote in a Jewish National Assembly, Palestinians would vote in a Palestinian National Assembly, and then there would be a local assembly in which everyone would vote together to address issues of local concern. So these are regimes that of what you might call mixed and overlapping sovereignty that allow for different forms of jurisdiction to coexist side by side with one another. And I think that the hope behind people who are advocating for these visions is again to try to find a way in which we can, without moving people, without partitioning this land to which many people have a very deep attachment, try to find a way to create a regime which gives opportunities for national self-expression to Jews and Palestinians, and even maybe to ultra-Orthodox Jews, people living in this region, while at the same time then creating overarching umbrella legislative mechanisms that would allow people to make decisions in common as well.
But do you think that the prospects for that are greater post 7th of October, or rather the opposite? Because the organizing principle of the Zionist nation state is really to give all the powers, or most of them, to the Jews. I mean, at the end of the day, the deciding power is the Jews. And these alternative models undercut that very specific principle.
Yes, I mean, these alternative models, as I understand them, are designed to counteract Jewish supremacy, right? They're designed to treat everyone in the region as a minority, so to speak, and not to privilege Jewish self-determination over other forms of self-determination in the region. Here, I guess I come back to my long-term versus short-term distinction, because you're correct that in the short term, it certainly seems like Israeli politics is just going to move in a rightward direction. And if anyone, I guess in my more optimistic vein...
I don't think actually it's like a right versus left thing. It's really a more fundamental thing about attachment to the Zionist idea of a nation state protecting us, really in the most basic terms.
I agree that there's a sense of increased existential threat that Jews feel as Jews, with the result that in the short term, they may be less inclined to give up on Jewish privileges of various kinds. I mean, I hear it, like in shocking contexts, like, in idle chats with, people in my yoga class, they say things like, without the state of Israel, we're lost. So I think you're right that one response to the intense trauma of October 7th is to think I am vulnerable as a Jew, not just as an Israeli, and therefore, like the political regime that rules this region has to put Jews first. So I do think that it would be naive to think that in the short term there's going to be a mass political movement of people saying, let's break up the nation state and instead divide this region into cantons. And so I don't want to make that argument, because I do think it is a naive argument. At the same time, if we think about the long-term structures and the protracted nature of this crisis, which isn't going away. And I think that's one thing that October 7th actually did do, was shake Israeli Jews out of their complacency and remind them that the conflict is still there and is still the fundamental fact that defines the terms of all of our existence in the region. There, I do think maybe that the sense of fragility of sovereignty, weakness of the state can create, and I think the changing understanding of Jewish historical consciousness, right? The sense that the state of Israel doesn't necessarily constitute an exception to the laws of Jewish history. That's where I think on the kind of subterranean level, those more fundamental shifts in Israeli Jewish self-understanding, in our narratives of Jewish political history, they might open up some conceptual space for these alternative forms of thinking.
So what you're saying is that despite the kind of contraction of fear, there's a space for political imagination that wants to be out of that fear, that wants to say, hey, we need to have a definitive border. We need to figure out, what sovereignty actually means and how a state actually works. And I think that one of the things that we do see post-October 7th is an understanding that a lot of what people thought were the strong powers of the state, there's no longer faith in those.
Yeah.
And in that sense, there's new possibilities for imagining, what power or what security means or how it really is defended. So I'm very interested in it from the point of view of the movement of Land for All.
Yeah.
Which is kind of advocating for a confederation. But one of the things that everyone keeps hearing is, how could you propose something that that there's not a majority for? But in a way, you're proposing that there's this shift in consciousness in the longer term is something that is going to be different than what we see in this immediate moment.
Yes, I mean, I maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, and I acknowledge that it may just all be wishful thinking, but I really do think that this is a moment in which, and again, I'm speaking now about Jewish self-understanding, and I'm going to limit my remarks to Jewish self-understanding, but acknowledging that, to actually move forward, this is a conversation between Jews and Palestinians. But I want to talk about what I think may have changed, again, on a very fundamental and perhaps still unconscious level within in Jewish self-understanding that could make that conversation possible in new ways in the future. Because I do think that standard Zionist narratives of modern Jewish history really did present the establishment of the state as the sort of the goal and endpoint of modern Jewish history, as a moment of epochal change that like fundamentally changed the conditions of existence of Jews both in Israel and in the world at large, precisely because Jews were no longer going to be vulnerable to pogroms, violence, anti-Semitism, discrimination of all the kind that plagued Jews in diaspora. And on October 7th, the moment that narrative was really shattered and Jews thought, wait, I was told that this couldn't happen here, and it did. In fact, there was a pogrom on the southern border, and the fact that we have a state, an army, an intelligence establishment really did nothing to protect us. And so there, I think that the sense of the sharp divide between diaspora and state is eroded, again, on a level that may still be unconscious, that many people haven't fully processed, and it may still just take the form of this like pervasive fear. But I guess my hope is that erosion of the stark border between diaspora existence and state existence will change our narrative of Jewish political history, such that the state of Israel is no longer regarded as the peak, as the telos, as the endpoint of modern Jewish politics, but rather just one point along a spectrum. And at that point, forms of Jewish politics that were present in the diaspora may have a place in Israel as well, because it's no longer the case that Israel has to represent an exception to all forms of Jewish politics that preceded it. And I think that's where the new political imagination can come from.
I want to put the question of the limitation of the nation state in a perhaps broader and comparative context, because thinking about it, the end of the nation state was heralded, I think, in the 90s or even before by the European Union, and the same argument or a similar argument was made that there were some processes, irreversible processes, that were set in motion, and therefore it's just a one-way street in a way. And in the following decades, we've seen the resurgence of the striking back of the nation state. Do you see any parallels to be drawn between your thinking about the Jewish state and what happened to nation states in the world at large?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because you're right that Israel is not an isolated instance of these larger currents. And I would say that I think we're in the midst of a debate that is still open, because as you just mentioned, in the 1990s, there were these very optimistic claims about the end of the nation state, the end of sovereignty, the waning of sovereignty, and then we saw Grexit, the election of Donald Trump, and there was a very strong backlash, and it turns out that many people are invested in sovereignty. And in Israel, too, many people are invested in sovereignty. And so I certainly think, that the calls for the demise of sovereignty were premature, and the backlash was a very powerful backlash. But the fact of the backlash doesn't mean that the debate has ended. It just means the debate is still extremely intense, even violent, right? And so I think Israel is I would say, part of that same historical moment in which we have forces that are pushing against sovereignty, undermining sovereignty, fraying sovereignty, and then there's a backlash that says, no, we need walls, we need borders, we need the power that the state supposedly provides. And so I think maybe what we're witnessing now is a similar moment in Israel. I guess I would say, again, it's premature to say that to issue a verdict in one direction or the other. It just points to the intensity of the debate. And that's in part what I was trying to say about Jewish political history, is that I think it was always premature to say Zionism won or the nation state won in 1948, and that was the end of the story. Because I think what we're seeing now is the surprising return of forms of diasporic Jewish politics that were supposedly refuted by history. And it turns out they didn't go away, and they have this surprising stickiness. And to me, that's just a sign that we're still in the midst of the debate, and it has not been resolved one way or the other.
I just want to say that how much I appreciate your work, and especially at this moment where there is a narrowing space for having alternative ideas than the ones that are present and the ones that are endorsed by the government, and how important it is to keep having these conversations and hearing these ideas to be able to get out of the place that where we're in.
Yes, I mean, I think that alternative forms of imagination are vital and essential precisely at this moment, which is such a dark moment. And I want to stress the darkness, the sense of pervasive despair that increases every day, that this war goes on, that hostages have not returned, that Gazans are starving, and that there is no sense of direction of any way out. And on the one hand, this might precisely in such a dark moment, it might seem like we're engaged in an abstract academic exercise, and I don't deny that there are elements of that, but I do think it's important precisely in these very dark moments to still cling to the possibility of an alternative political horizon. And again, it might be wishful thinking, but I really do want to believe that precisely because of the depth of the trauma, the depth of despair, that people's self-understanding is changing in ways that will have yet unforeseen consequences that really could open up space for new political thinking.
Dr. Julie Cooper, thank you very much for this.
Thanks.